Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today for this SURF webinar series. Today, our presentation is titled More Than a Liability, ESG, UN SDGs, and Sustainable Remediation. I am Gerlindy Wolf, the current SURF president. Next slide, please. SURF, or Sustainable Remediation Forum, is a nonprofit organization. We are dedicated to advancing sustainable remedies and practices on a local and global scale through collaboration, education, and innovation. One of the ways we do that is by this free public webinar series, and we're so glad that you're here. Today we have a collaborative presentation from two wonderful speakers. First off, Roy Thurn from GHG. He is an accomplished environmental portfolio manager and climate resiliency and sustainability thought leader with more than 35 years of experience working both in environmental consulting and as a BP remediation management group. Roy is a former SURF Board of Trustees member, as well as one of the founding members of the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transit Authority Sustainability Council. He's a regular contributor to a variety of publications and guidance documents, including from the ITRC and ASTM. Next up, we're going to turn it over to Paige Molzon. She has a BS in chemical engineering and an MS in environmental engineering, both from Oregon State University, and 7 years of experience at Jacobs, where she is a project manager for PFAS remediation projects and a leader for sustainability initiatives. Paige is currently on the SURF Board of Trustees as the secretary. She regularly uses the SiteWise tool to evaluate environmental impact of remedies and develops tools and educates teams on new ways to implement and account for sustainability on projects, including with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and environmental social governance. So kicking off, we're going to pass it over to Roy for the first half of this presentation.
Great, thank you. First check, is everybody seeing my first slide? We'll make sure I have the right screen.
Yes.
Great, thanks, Gerlindy. Well, welcome everybody. Yeah, Paige and I have had the opportunity in San Diego to present these topics, so we hope you enjoy them. They're very complementary to each other. I start out by talking about ESG ratings and sustainable development goal performance and whether or not they're mutually exclusive. And let me just dive right in. We'll chat about this. So some interesting things about ESG ratings and SDGs, short for, of course, Sustainable Development Goals. And ESG, most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with environmental, social, and governance, really, which is primarily a rating tool used by various entities to be able to assess these sustainable commitments made by corporations around the world, but not necessarily limited to just them. So are they mutually exclusive? Well, of course they're not. It's really a rhetorical question. You know, and we know that improved ESG ratings do lend support to all 17 of the SDGs. And the graphic you're seeing on your screen right now shows how those relate to each other, the ESG and SDGs. So there you go there. Let's continue to look to see how this goes together. So why is ESG rapidly growing while SDG performance is poor? First of all, many people may not have known that SDG performance has not been as stellar as global countries, you know, countries around the world, and as well as companies around the world have committed to these UN SDGs, either all of them or some of them. But in fact, the last report, UN report on how well the SDGs are actually performing show that they're really not necessarily meeting the expectations in some areas that one would think. And here we're just looking on the slide, you know, ESG performance items, some of the differences here. ESGs are primarily influenced by publicly traded companies. I kind of indicated that a little earlier. And good ESG ratings do provide financial benefits to companies. People like myself and most surfers, like to be able to invest in companies that have a strong sustainability commitment. Banks and others certainly are doing more of the same. But unlike sustainable development goals, ESG ratings are not a reflection of impact on people and the planet. So that's just something to keep in mind with regard to ESG. When we look at SDG on the right side of your screen, here's some of the facts here. 83% of companies state that they do support UN SDGs. That's a large amount. 40% of companies set measurable commitments for SDGs. And 193 member states, another term for countries, have committed to the UN SDGs. So you have this strong commitment there, and we see ESG as motivating companies to certainly do better in their efforts to be more sustainable. So let's look at some other things. When we compare, this was from GlobeScan that does these surveys all the time, and this one was really interesting. It's comparing the importance to the performance, and specifically, we're looking at how large companies are performing in these 4 Boston Square areas. And I point you to the upper right circle, or excuse me, your upper left circle, and we look at the barriers to change. And interestingly enough, when we talk about in terms of sustainability, some of the issues and barriers are supporting regulations to provide sustainable options, making it more convenient to live sustainably, and making it more desirable to live sustainably. Those are the biggest barriers to change from a company perspective. So, there is this disparity between ESG and SDG that perhaps may be more closely related to the sphere of influence differences between companies and countries. As we're noting again in that circle in the upper left corner, it's some of the things that are somewhat outside the control of a company, right? When we talk about policy. Now, it's not to say a company couldn't voluntarily do certain things, but in some cases they may not be able to do certain things by prohibition with respect to regulations or policies within their countries they operate. Now, corporate support for sustainable government policies is certainly important to enable these sustainable lifestyles. So there is this dichotomy as to, we recognize that corporations, large companies see these as barriers, but at the same time, how much effort are they putting forth to actually influence these arguable barriers themselves? So, in any event, the argument would be like probably a little bit weak in the performance area in terms of actually influencing sustainable policies. Because the bottom line for publicly traded corporations is they are there to make profit primarily to the benefit of their shareholders. Now, to the extent their shareholders value sustainability, that will influence how they, in fact, address things like policy and regulations in the countries and states in which they operate. So ESG and SDG, well, they can overlap with remediation. And this is taken from a ERM article that I just loved, and I said, oh wow, this sums it up. You see in this graphic, right, it says the ability to influence sustainability, and then the triangles that you're seeing are really the life cycle of remediation. And what you're seeing is basically the ability to impart and influence the sustainable footprint of a remediation site begins to diminish more and more as the site progresses through each phase, ultimately to completing that remediation and possible reuse. So we've known this in the remediation world for decades, that the best way to provide the most influence as far as impacting cost or impacting the remedy itself is in those earlier negotiations. And the same holds true for sustainability. So we want to improve environmental, social, and economic conditions. The argument would be, regardless if you're thinking of ESG or SDG, you want to try and impart that type of strategy and negotiations early on into a remediation site. And by the way, please feel free to enter your questions or thoughts into the chat box throughout this presentation, as well as pages. Betsy and Gerlinde will be monitoring those, and we'll come back to that during the Q&A portion. All credit for this slide to Ramble. Ramble has developed a product called Sure. I believe it was the first of its kind. It is very cool in that Ramble has taken the time to fully integrate basically the assessment of your remedy with how they marry up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when you use Ramble's Sure tool, you're able to actually see changes that you make to your remedial design, how that will benefit or pull away from any of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And as an example, and you can read in here how those are cross-connected. For example, air, talking about greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants, and connecting that to climate action, and so on and so forth. But in one of the examples, which I'll show you here, in these colorful pinwheel diagrams, this is one of the outputs for which the Sure tool will provide. This is a comparison of two remedial approaches that you might look at while using Sure. And what you should note here is the darker colors. So as the darker colors radiate from the center out to the outer edge, that's telling you in this rose diagram type view how much influence that remedy or remedy component has on that particular SDG. So for instance, if you looked at number 8, which I think is clean water in blue, on the left-hand side, you'll see it's fully connected, right? That remedy and that SDG are totally in sync. Whereas if you looked at the one next to it, let's see, number 3, I think, that is in that reddish color, and I can't read upside down, but you can see at least on the left-hand side, there's very little influence. As you went to modify your remedy, you can see that same area in that darkish, we'll call it reddish purple color. You can see it's gained some importance and influence with the changes that were made, but you lost a little bit in the clean water section. So it does give you this great insight as to directly correlating how your remedy or remedial changes, optimization, would directly correlate to benefits to Sustainable Development Goals. So kudos to Ramble for developing Sure. But they're not the only ones. Jacobs, I'm not getting paid for any of this, by the way. I actually work for a competitor, but we are all part of SURF and love to support sustainability. So Jacobs has developed Evolve as a mapping tool, which is really cool as well. So similar to what Ramble has done, Evolve also maps the remedy components to the Sustainable Development Goals in a manner that allows you to consider in your planning process how changes that you might make to your remedy would influence and support the Sustainable Development Goals. So also kudos to Jacobs for developing Evolve. So continuing on, now we know we have these tools. We know that ESG and SDG are certainly connected. We also can recognize that sustainable remediation arguably should benefit both ESG and SDGs. So let's look to see how that plays out in the real world. And what I picked here were 3 different types of sites, Superfund or CERCLA sites, RCRA site, and a brownfield site. I selected these sites not because they did or didn't necessarily portray specific sustainable attributes, but because they are significant sites under each of these regulatory regimes. So here we have, and by the way, when we talk about like Bartlett Station, it's a Brownfields Award winner. Okay, so we're, again, it's not cherry picking. This is just to give you an example of how ESG, SDG, and sustainable remediation are or are not being integrated. So what we are seeing is that ESG does tend to ferret out, by its nature, greenwashing. And for those of you not familiar with the term greenwashing, it's basically when a company or really an entity says they're doing things to be sustainable, but in fact, when looking at their actions or other aspects of their company and operations, they turn out to be not as accurate as portrayed. And this has actually come out in a lot of different lawsuits, unfortunately, where things have not been as truthful, perhaps, as advertised by the individual company. It's not all the time, but it does happen. So application of sustainable remediation practices does continue to arguably be an exception. And I say arguably because you all are certainly involved with remediation that has integrated a lot of great sustainable practices, and we applaud you for that. But it is not, in my experience and my research, commonplace. So let's look a little deeper at these sites. Here's the Elizabeth Mine Superfund site in South Stratford, Vermont. Again, it's a CERCLA site under US EPA. So when we look at the sustainable footprint, here you can see on the left-hand side the things that stand out: air quality preservation, they look at energy and fuel, water quality preservation and conservation, materials use, waste and reduction, land conservation, ecosystem service protection. So that is all really good things that you would like to see on sites, and it's great to see that here. Just a couple of photos of the site, the pre and post, if you will, some of the scarring that was on the site and some of the remedial restoration efforts taking place on the right-hand picture. So Elizabeth Mine, the Pharmacia Upjohn RCRA site, a very famous site, sustainable footprint items, minimizing the carbon footprint, right? Optimizing groundwater treatment using solar, repurposing buildings, constructing wetlands for biodiversity, and then providing that social aspect by including a trail system into the redevelopment. So nice job at Pharmacia. Pharmacia is often highlighted as one of the stalwarts in sustainable remediation and reuse. And last but not least, the Bartlett Station brownfield development in Boston, Massachusetts. We look at the sustainable footprint there. You have a low to moderate income housing, commercial spaces, more jobs, they're a net energy producer, improved air quality. We see this environmental justice theme often connected with brownfield sites, outdoor park area in next phase, and then senior living is for the next phase. So 3 different sites and 3 different regulatory regimes, and emphasizing different aspects of sustainability, again, environmental, social, and economic from the standpoint of sustainability. So when we look at state and federal influence, we see that policy and regulations make a difference, right? National actions like CERCLA, they have greatly influenced response and handling of contaminated sites, no question about that. Sustainability, though, is typically not a regulatory requirement of a remedy. There are some states that are working harder to integrate sustainability as part of remedies under their state programs, but it's not typically an ARAR. It's not a appropriate and relevant, or applicable and relevant and appropriate regulatory standard under the NCP, or National Contingency Plan, here in the United States. But there is no regulatory requirement also to consider ESG for remediation. So while that is currently being debated in the US administration how ESG should be or not be part of consideration, to be determined. But there is also no regulatory requirement to consider SDGs for remediation. So what is this all saying? Well, it's saying that companies and countries are making commitments. But remember, when we looked at large companies in that Boston Square in the upper left corner, one of the big barriers was policy. And this is bearing out. We're seeing that when we look at the major sites, the major regulatory areas in the US, RCRA, CERCLA, brownfields, we do see that sustainability is more of a volunteer effort by a responsible party or company, state, whoever's dealing with that cleanup, rather than a regulatory requirement. You look on the right side, we look at the interesting now different lens. When you look at the regulatory regimes under CERCLA, RCRA, and brownfields, you start to see this little differentiation start to occur. This isn't always the case. So I know some people are going to harp on the fact like, well, this isn't true. I've had a site that, we did more, all three of the sustainability areas, right? And I get that, and I'm not disagreeing that that can be the case. But in general, my experience shows that when we're talking about sustainability and CERCLA sites, the tendency tends to focus on greenhouse gas reduction. When we talk about RCRA sites and brownfield sites, there tends to be more emphasis on the social and economic portions of sustainability. These are just general observations, and happy to answer questions when we're all done as to what your experience has been. So just to summarize here, ESG ratings and SDGs are not mutually exclusive. We know that. But what we also tend to see is that remediation sites, they do provide keen insights on the limits of ESG influence, meaning that while companies would commit to net zero, they commit to SDGs, when it comes to remediating sites and employing tools, techniques, and remedial methods that are more sustainable and more in alignment with SDGs, it's more of a voluntary effort, and that volunteer effort is somewhat lacking when we look at remediation. It's some companies do a great job of it. Some entities, it could be Department of Energy, Department of Defense, do a nice job of it, but it's not required, and therefore it's limited in how widespread it is occurring. So when we talk about poor SDG performance, as stated by the UN's own evaluations, it really is more likely a reflection of a lack of substantive efforts by governments than corporations. And when I say governments, I'm including the regulations and policy which governs these actions by companies, and with respect especially to remediation. And last but not least, when we talk about policy and regulatory actions that account for ESG and SDGs, they may be part of the answer to affecting significant SDG performance. They're not the only part of it, but we see that with policy and regulations, we know that more positive results in the areas of ESG and SDG would occur, especially SDG, if that in fact is a priority for governments, and that could be local, state, or federal. But as it stands right now, at least with SDGs, we have countries that are committing to SDGs, but when it rolls down, at least into the world of remediation, we're not there yet. And with that, I think I have covered my section. So thank you for that. I can hand off to Paige next.
All right, can you hear and see me and my screen? Is it showing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Roy. Teed me up perfect per usual. So my name is Paige Molzon. Like Lindy said, I work at Jacobs, and today I'm going to be talking with you all about remediation project influence on ESG priorities. So first up, what is ESG and why does it matter? This is kind of just a repeat of information that Roy just presented. I'm going to kind of focus on the pieces that are most important for my talk today. So what is ESG? Why does it matter? ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, which we just learned. These are the three key factors considered when measuring sustainability and ethical impact of organizations. These factors are, of course, considered alongside financial factors, play an important role in the investment decision-making process for stakeholders. So stakeholders are beginning to recognize that utilizing this ESG framework allows for a more common language and shared purpose, similar to the UN SDGs, when they're trying to define the sustainability terms that can be a little bit more difficult to grasp or tie metrics to. So in general, a higher ESG score demonstrates to stakeholders that a company is keeping pace with policy developments and is working towards more sustainable operations. So over here in this nice graphic, we can see the three main components of ESG and examples of some subcategories within those. A few may stand out to those of us in remediation in the environmental category. I think we're probably more familiar with these environmental criteria as a concept. We're probably more able to accurately measure and understand each of these. And then sometimes the S&G components can be a little more challenging to digest or tie directly to our remediation projects, so we'll talk about those later. One other note about ESG in general is that there are specific ESG criteria that are priorities for different clients. So ESG priorities may vary based on specific industries. I think those of us in remediation that are consultants may work with a wide variety of clients. So this is important to note that ESG is not the same for all of our different types of clients. So now that we have a basic understanding of ESG, we'll move on to the main goal of my presentation today, where I'm hoping to demonstrate to all of you that remediation projects can truly impact corporate sustainability goals and the ESG priorities of our clients. So at Jacobs, we've developed a methodology. It's not as fancy as Evolve or Shore for UN SDGs, but we've developed this methodology we've established that allows us to add a sustainability lens to the remediation work, allowing our clients to maximize their sustainability outputs and help them meet their ESG goals, trying to make it a more simple implementation of this process. There's some initial setup to the process, but once established for one client, it can be kind of utilized and minimally edited for any type of project within that client portfolio. So today I'm going to walk you through the entire process. But in general, our process is first we evaluate the ESG reports and priorities of that company for that industry and establish the areas of importance. Next, we will select, define, and weigh. We'll select the criteria that is vital to a company's success and then define the scales and weight those components. Next, we will score or rank our specific project alternatives based on their expected performance. Then we will review this nice little graphic here. We'll review the outcome of our evaluation, comparing the influence on ESG criteria against cost for each of those project alternatives. And then finally, we'll make our selection based on all of this information. So now you can see the whole big picture of the process. I'll walk you through each step. I'll walk you through today with a hypothetical client example. We've conducted this evaluation previously on different DAO remediation projects. But today it's just a generic example of the process. So like I said, step one, we're going to get an understanding of the ESG priorities specific to a company and its industry. This step, like I said, is imperative to understanding which ESG criteria are important to this specific industry and client and where we have the greatest ability to impact the company. So we pull from some of these external sources. You can see some listed here. And evaluate the criteria within an industry and then weigh each based on their expected degree of impact on a company. So for example, this little graphic here is from S&P. It indicates that banks and pharmaceuticals have very different ESG priorities, as you might have guessed, kind of just explaining why it's important to understand our industry. So to start our ESG process, we review as many of these resources as possible within what's reasonable. And then we also review our clients' ESG reports, get an understanding of their goals. This evaluation allows us to more clearly see what's vital to the client's success and their resilience, and demonstrates where we as a project might have an opportunity to impact. Once we've determined which criteria are of the most interest to the client, we like to set them up on our ESG spectrum. So this step is a nice visual understanding of our ESG goals and where a company currently stands in each. So first we have this x-axis here, the ESG spectrum. This scale ranges from compliance to leader, showing where a company is currently performing in each category. I'll show you a few examples in a moment. And then next we have our y-axis, which is the ability to influence. This demonstrates how great the potential is for influencing a specific ESG component. Is there an opportunity for maybe significant or limited or minimal influence on those ESG criteria? So I'll step through a few examples of showing how we set this up. So I like to start with environmental because, like I said, these are the most familiar to me, and I'm assuming for most of you as well. A lot of the environmental categories remediation projects do have the ability to influence these environmental priorities. So we can typically assume that some of these criteria are higher up on the ability to influence spectrum. And then the ESG spectrum on the bottom, it may vary depending on the client, how strong they are in these areas already. So you can see we have energy and biodiversity and things like that, where a remediation project does have a greater ability to influence. Next, a few social examples. Excuse me. These are a little trickier to grasp, but in general, there are a lot of social priorities that that companies set up for their ESG criteria. So understanding our ability to influence those may be a little more challenging. So for example, on here, we can see maybe our industry of interest has prioritized training and education as one of their social priorities. However, maybe a remediation project doesn't have that great of an ability to influence how an entire company implements this internally. On the other hand, though, remediation projects often have construction components, so a project may have a much more significant impact on worker health and safety, so showing up in a more significant ability to influence. Finally, the governance examples. These ones are the trickiest category for me personally, so if there's any governance experts, let me know. But a few examples shown here of governance priorities. Similar to social, in that a project may not have the greatest ability to impact some of these criteria, like for example, employment. Our remediation project is not going to impact our clients' employment policies, but we can impact in other areas, maybe like in economic performance or innovation, some things like that. So although we could spend time considering all of the ESG criteria that is defined for our industry and client, we do not have the capacity for that. So especially for today's presentation, we're going to focus in on these boxed criteria where we have, as a remediation project, the most significant ability to influence our client's ESG score. So we'll focus on this red box up here. Which brings us to our next step, defining the scales used for each component. So these scales need to be easily understood and defined so we can later defensively score and rank our remediation alternatives. Keep in mind, like I said, we can have as many of these or as few as desired based on the client and project specific needs and what we're able to do with our budget. So the first step in defining our scales here, I've shown the environmental ones again first. The first thing we need to understand is the difference between a natural and a constructed scale. So a natural scale directly describes the objective that they represent. So what we expect as actuals. An obvious example of natural scale is money. We have a decent idea of what a technology will cost us, and this is a great time to use a natural scale. On the other hand, we have a constructed scale, which is, of course, constructed. This is more of a ranking-based scale, a best to worst, or a 1 to 5. So we utilize this method for any of our criteria that do not have natural scales. Obviously, you can kind of think of this as quantitative versus qualitative. Our preference is always to use natural scales representing actuals. However, As you will see, some of these E, S, and G, especially the S and G criteria, are a little more difficult to measure and set up scales for. So I'll just step through two of our environmental examples quickly. So emissions, you can see here, most companies, if not all, now have a commitment to reduce annual carbon emissions. This is something that we're able to estimate. So we have our best to worst feasible outcomes is a natural scale. So best is the lowest emissions. In comparison, we have biodiversity. So biodiversity is, there are tools out there now where we're able to get a better understanding of actuals on biodiversity. However, for this example, we'll say we don't have access to those tools. So we do have a goal of increasing the number of species and plants and enhancing our habitats. However, maybe we just need to construct a scale. So best feasible, positive impact on biodiversity, worst feasible is a negative impact on biodiversity. So that will set up our scale there. Next, a couple social criteria. These two, I think we truly do see the ability of a remediation project to influence these. So first up is health and safety. For health and safety, we'll implement a constructed scale ranging from, just baseline health and safety. I think everyone on this call prioritizes health and safety number one. So the baseline is already a really good condition. However, if we want to go above and beyond, maybe we'd get a score of 5, a best feasible outcome where we're really going above and beyond in our health and safety implementation. And kind of similarly, we'll construct a scale for the local communities aspect. So leaving a site better than it was found. We can just have baseline, worst feasible, again, not a terrible outcome, but if we really want to go above and beyond, get a best feasible outcome, maybe we're collaborating with the community, we're conducting surveys, maybe we're doing things that are addressing some of the unmet needs of a community and really going above and beyond again in our remedial designs. Okay, so the next step in our process is to weight each of the criteria from our table. So this step is optional. We can just leave each criteria as equally important, or we can lean back on those resources we pulled from earlier, like the S&P rankings, and pull in the weights for our given industry. Or another option is to complete a stakeholder survey. So we can get an understanding of which ESG components our client sees as the most important and vital to the success of their project or company. So either way we go, whether we decide to wait or not, we have completed the first 2 steps of our process, which although seems a bit time consuming, now that we have this framework set up, we can utilize this on any remediation project for the client with pretty minimal editing. Which brings us to step 3. So this includes the scoring and ranking of remediation project alternatives. For this next step, we're going to just evaluate a very, very simple scenario. Pretty obvious here, we're going to compare no action to FIDO remediation. We will give both the no action and the FIDO scores based on the scales we previously defined. So keep in mind that we have some natural and some constructed scales in there. I'll just quickly show the scoring for each. I'm sure you can all guess that FIDO remediation scores much higher on our ability to impact these ESG criteria than the no action. I know this is an incredibly simplified example. However, it's just purely for demonstration. We are able to implement this approach on a much more complex site or project, so we can have as many of those ESG criteria as we want or as many remedial alternatives as we'd like. After we score them, we move on to step 4, where we will review the outcome of our evaluation. One simple outcome is this graphic, and this is just a simple comparison between the no action and the FIDO remediation and the ability of each to influence those specific ESG criteria. Obviously, again, the FIDO remediation alternative has a much greater ability to influence these criteria. And then we can, of course, include cost in our evaluation. We recognize how simple this example is, but this next slide here will demonstrate the results from a little bit more complex example. So we have an expanded output here, bringing us to step 5. So this might represent an evaluation where we included 6 remedial alternatives we're looking at, and we have our ESG criteria split out more specifically. The graphic allows for easy viewing of the remediation project alternatives and their direct impact on the ESG priorities. And of course, we can include cost. There are several other factors we're all aware of that go into determining which remedial alternative we'll select, but this is just to help determine whether a project cost is truly worth its impact on ESG. Using these results, we can then select our remedial alternative. And then once we've selected this, the influenced ESG criteria can easily be tracked throughout the lifetime of the project because we've already defined the scales for each of those criteria. We can use those defined scales to compare the actual performance to what was initially expected and use those goals and progress to assist in decision making along the way through our project. That brings me to my conclusion slide here. So finally, utilization of this approach allows for a more standardized methodology that can be used through the lifetime of a project to assist our project teams in managing up their positive impact and managing down their negative impact of the ESG criteria. Overall, this demonstrates that small-scale remediation projects can have the potential to positively influence corporate sustainability goals and ESG. And with that, I'm on my last slide. So thank you to my co-authors here, support from Dow, and of course, the team from Jacob. So please feel free to reach out with any questions. And I think that's it for me. Gerlindy, I'll stay on the screen for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Paige and Roy. Great presentations as always. We've gotten some questions starting to come in, so I'll start throwing them at our speakers, but please continue to add those into the chat, and we'll see what their thoughts are on it. I'd like to start with a question maybe aimed at Roy, but Paige, you might have thoughts on it as well. Roy, you said near the end of your presentation that there's no regulatory requirement to consider ESG for remediation. And I guess just yesterday, Forbes published an article where they write that over 2/3 of US state legislatures have considered anti-ESG legislation in 2023, and 14 states have enacted legislation restricting the use of ESG factors in public investment and procurements, which perhaps is more of a statement than a question. Maybe the question is, what are your thoughts on it? Or is ESG already on its way out? It's been politicized and it's on the way out.
I don't think ESG is on its way out. I think it is politicized, and what we are unfortunately seeing in the United States is a division between political mindsets, and eventually, regardless of what individual states are doing, I think what we will find is that public opinion, which is driving these ESG ratings independently of policy and the investments, and Paige noted that, how World Bank and others, right, they are deeply vested in ESG in terms of what projects they select, which companies they allow or will invest in or provide funding to. That's only going to continue. And as we live in this world of climate change with fires burning around the world and horrific flooding and hurricanes, etc., it only materializes the fact that we have to be more conscientious of what we do and the footprints. So ESG will survive regardless of what individual states or policy does. I hope that we'll see countries and states within the United States start adopting some form of ESG policy to help influence and bolster companies that I think want to do the right thing, but the problem is they somewhat get in conflict with their shareholders that are just interested in bottom line profit. And so you sometimes need to have that stick there by regulation to help motivate, if you will, the results that you're seeking.
Yeah, thank you. Anything you want to add?
I couldn't hear you. Were you talking to me?
I said if there was anything you wanted to add, but I'm happy to jump next question if you don't have any burning additions.
No, I'm good. Thanks, Betsy.
Okay. We had another question come in from the audience. Do y'all think we can understand and apply ESG without a good understanding of the SDGs and of sustainable remediation? And then they sort of follow on to say, and where can I get more information? Where should I be going to learn about these topics? So sort of a two-parter there.
Do you want to start, Paige, or do you want me?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. So to the question on just, first I'll start with the backside. To get more knowledge on ESGs and SDGs, really because as Betsy just noted from the prior question, at least in the US, there isn't a solid guidance on it. EPA and others have not adopted anything. The best way is to look at what is being produced by a couple, Sustainability Institute. They just merged, but there's GRI and Institute of Sustainability, I think is their latest term, but they're developing guidances all the time with respect to sustainability, and what they're ultimately trying to do is influence corporate behavior as well, and utilize their platforms and their guidances as the basis for ESG. So if you research ESG, you'll find both entities that do the ratings, but also entities that produce guidances that support those rating structures. And unfortunately, there's not a one-stop shop. When it comes to SDGs, certainly if you type in UN SDGs, you'll get to the United Nations site, and then everything you'd ever want to know about SDGs, including how countries are performing, how, generally speaking, SDGs in general are performing globally. You'll find all that information there. With respect to guidance, if you're talking specifically in the realm of remediation, ASTM, ITRC, or Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, and ISO, SURF UK has guidance as well. There's a lot of good guidance out there with respect to how to integrate sustainability into your remediation. Was there another part to that, Betsy?
I think you hit all the parts.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Paige, the next question is for you. Someone asked, what sustainability tracking methods have been successful for your projects? Have there been any challenges to your ability to quantify and communicate progress in your sustainability goals? The age-old question.
Yeah, of course. So far in my work with sustainable remediation, my main goal has been trying to make these things trackable, which is the development of this tool, and make things easier to have a more universal system to describe and track progress on. So this tool and then the Evolve tool that Roy mentioned are both platforms that we're trying to push across programs and on projects to have a more universal system for tracking our progress and our actions and our commitments to the UN SDG and specific ESG criteria. So it's continuously changing. Like I said, the social and the governance aspects, there are plenty of UN SDGs that tie to those as well. Finding the actual measurable components to each of those has been definitely challenging. So if anybody on the call has things that have worked for those kind of harder to define metrics, I'd definitely be open to learning. Always trying to improve our tools here. So
have you found that these frameworks and these tools have helped the process of goal setting, of tracking?
Definitely, especially like Roy said, if we catch it early enough on in a project. So the point of especially the Evolve tool is to start project startup, right? Let's just set any actions or commitments that we want to start tracking and make progress towards at the very beginning of our project. And that way we're tracking it throughout. So if we catch a project early enough, we've had good success in showing that progress. And I think a lot of us that work in environmental remediation are already kind of making sustainable decisions. It's just nice to see the progress actually being measured and showing that we're meeting these goals, especially connected to those UN SDGs.
Thanks, Paige. Another question for either of you. Based on your experience, do you know of any companies that have highlighted sustainable remediation projects in their ESG reports and actually highlighted how that remediation project helped them advance their ESG goals? Have you all seen that yet?
Well,
I haven't.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think it would be. ESG reporting is interesting. For the most part, it's a 100 questionnaire item questionnaire that companies voluntarily fill out. So it would be unlikely that they would ad lib to add a specific case example in the ESG questionnaire. In their 10K reporting, that would be more likely in terms of highlighting successes with respect to environmental spend that they would have to report anyways. And I have seen that especially where it fits into the corporate responsibility and sustainability efforts of the company. So there's times when that'll weave its way into the discussion. Of note, though, Betsy, just to add on to that a little bit, I had mentioned that we don't, depending on what regulatory regime you're in, you either see more of a focus on greenhouse gas emissions or the social side of sustainability, but not necessarily all three. And part of the reason for that occurring, besides the regulations and policies not necessarily requiring it, is that in recognition of carbon footprints, most remediation sites are nowhere near in the same realm of greenhouse gas emissions as what companies will produce as part of their operations, their manufacturing process, etc. They understand that, and I think we as consultants or people that want to see more sustainability built into everything we do, perhaps get a little bit harsh on our criticisms, but I acknowledge it that companies could do better, but they are trying to balance a lot of things, and remediation sites, generally speaking, aren't going to have as much significance to the changes to their net zero commitments as a lot of other things they do. Not saying they shouldn't try, but I understand why they may not be giving the same level of importance. That said, won't go too far off topic, PFAS could be a game changer. So for those of us who understand the ubiquitous nature of PFAS in groundwater and what that is resulting in terms of billions of dollars in lawsuits and settlements and cleanups that are going to be occurring, while that may do better on the social and resource conservation portions of sustainability, on the side of greenhouse gas footprint, net zero contribution, I think it's to be determined whether or not we can effectively remediate or restore aquifers to remove PFAS to regulatory limits and still keep our carbon footprint small. I'm not sure that can happen because, again, how far and wide PFAS is found in groundwater.
Really interesting thought and brave of you to mention PFAS in the last 5 minutes of a presentation. That's the cliffhanger, perhaps, for a future webinar. We're at 5 minutes left, so I want to thank y'all again, Roy and Paige. Thanks everyone for attending, and turn it over to Gerlinde for our final surf news, including where to find this presentation. We've had a couple questions come in asking for where the recording will be available, so that will be posted. I think if Gerlinde doesn't have a slide about it, she'll mention it.
Mm-hmm. We do have a slide, so no worries. Again, thank you to both of our presenters and all of our audience. If you're interested in SURF and looking for more ways to get involved, SURF welcomes members from all aspects of the environmental industry. If you're not a member yet, take a look at our website and join us today. It's a great opportunity for professional networking within the remediation and sustainability fields. And we have a lot of different ways to get involved in the organization. You could present a webinar during our webinar series. If you have a topic you want to hear more about, give us ideas and we'll search for presentations on that topic. You can reach out to Chris Schultz at the email here provided to get on our calendar, to get on our list. SURF also works on technical initiatives. Right now, we are doing a technical initiative on environmental justice. You can contact Nicole Tucker at the email address provided for more information on that and potential ways to get involved in that technical initiative or start your own. Next slide, please. So we have an entire library of SURF presentations and webinars from the past few years. You can go over to YouTube, search for Sustainable Remediation Forum, and see our YouTube channel. Webinars, I think, are organized by year. We also have a playlist of training videos for 2 environmental footprint tools, SiteWise and CIFA, that you can view on there. SURF has a couple of events coming up. First off, our virtual membership meeting in 2 weeks on September 14th. It's from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. We're welcoming both current members and non-members to that meeting. Next up will be our in-person meeting, which is held in conjunction with the AHS East Coast Conference in Amherst, Massachusetts. The SURF meeting is on Tuesday, October 17th at 3:30 p.m. We'll also be hosting sustainable remediation themed technical sessions throughout the conference. You can visit our SURF website, sign up for our email list to get information on registration for both of those events. Finally, I would like to give a big shout out to our SURF sponsors listed here. Without their continued support, we wouldn't be able to continue as an organization, so we really appreciate them enabling SURF to continue our mission. So thanks to all of the companies listed here. With that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much for joining.